Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Bonner, Chief Editor of the Kyiv Post, Ukraine's English language newspaper since 1995. Today, we are going to prove Albert Einstein right. He once said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. Does not apply to our three guests here. They're experts in the energy sector, they're experts in state-owned governance, and that's the topic today. The big topic is a yes or no question, but I have the feeling the answer is actually more complicated. Does the state run state-owned enterprises in the energy sector effectively and smartly? We will set the table first for the discussion, but I want to introduce our speakers today. To my left, Andrei Boitsun. He's a specialist in corporate governance. I know him, and the public knows him as the editor of a team that produces a weekly rundown of state-owned enterprises, the events that are happening in the big companies that are controlled by the government of Ukraine. And then at my opposite end is Edward Chow. Edward is on the short list of every Ukrainian journalist who wants to understand the energy sector, and has been for many, many years. Written dozens, if not hundreds, of columns. He is still with the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He is a member of the DTEC Advisory Council, and I have to say DTEC is one of the sponsors of this webinar. And our final guest, who couldn't be with us because he's in a meeting in Chernivtsi, a different part of Ukraine, Valentin Gvozdy. He's the lead partner, one of the two lead partners with Go Law, one of the most prominent law firms in Ukraine. His interest in the area is manifold, but he is also the head of the supervisory board of Ukrhydroenergo, one of the big energy companies in Ukraine. Valentin, you can hear us?
Yes, I hear you. Thank you very much for introducing me.
Okay, I want to start with Andrei because he's been very good at framing the public issue in a way that we can all understand it. And through Andrei, I know that he tracks the top 15 state-owned enterprises. There are more than 3,000, and if you talk to Andrei on the regional, local level, there may be 12,000. Nobody knows for sure. But a big part of the economy in Ukraine is state-owned still, for better, and many would say for worse. Out of those top 15, Andrei is tracking, I count 5 energy firms. There's Naftogaz, Ukrenergo, Energoatom, gas transit system operator, and Ukrhydroenergo. Out of those, only 2 made a profit last year. That was the gas transit system and Ukrhydroenergo. The other 3 were unprofitable: Naftogaz, Energoatom, and the third one, unprofitability.
Unprofitability was Naftogaz, was Energoatom, and Ukrenergo.
And Ukrhydroenergo, yes, the grid operator. Why is this important? I mean, energy powers everything we do. I mean, from the lights to the heat to the cars to everything. And on top of that, we have a layer of the climate change and the changing climate, and so we have to restructure our energy sector to be A, energy independent, and B, climate friendly. I think whether it's public or private sector, I think all the guests would agree that Ukraine energy sector has failed in that regard. We're not energy independent. We have basically a regulatory mess where we have cross subsidies and cross debts. We have an archaic grid. We have outdated nuclear power plants. We have a lot of things that aren't budgeted in normal sectors for growth. And we also have declining oil and gas production. That's 30-year legacy of state-owned enterprises. So I want to ask Andrei his overall assessment, because he's put it very clearly about what is the proper role of the state, and very clear principles about whether the state should own a company or not. And if it should, how can it be effectively governed? And are they, I want his assessment of, are they now? So in the energy sector, these 5 that you're tracking, how would you answer those questions, Andrei?
So I will start with a couple of facts. So what you said about the financial performance of these 5 energy companies is correct. This is their performance in 2020, and indeed 3 out of 5 were loss-making. But if you look at the performance over the past 3 or 5 years, all of them were profitable, actually. So if you look at Naftogaz 2018-2020, it was profitable. If you look at Ukrenergo, in the same range, it was profitable, and so on. I think there is only one incident over the past 4 years that one of these companies was not profitable, and that's except 2020, and that's Energoatom in 2018. The numbers for 2020 are correct, but not necessarily representative for the longer-term performance of these energy companies. Now, getting to your question, in the ideal world, each of these 5 companies would be privately owned. The private owner is, in principle, more efficient and has better incentives than the state. But then the ideal world implies that you have a very efficient market infrastructure, very efficient markets, and it implies that where you don't, you have very strong regulation. And neither is the case in Ukraine today, unfortunately. And therefore, we have to talk about the second best solution, which is state owning, in this case, energy companies, when it's a better solution than when the same companies would be owned by a private, would be in the private hands. And so you mentioned the criteria that we discussed with you on another occasion, and we believe that the 3 criteria, and they're enshrined in a document which was approved by the government. Unfortunately, it's not a very, it doesn't have very strong legal power, but nevertheless, the document itself lays out very good principles for criteria for state ownership. When would the state choose to own a company? 1 is national security. 2 is a natural monopoly. And 3, fulfilling critical needs of the citizens. Now, if you run those 5 companies through these criteria, each of them would respond to, would conform to one of them. For example, Naftogaz is about national energy security. 2 transmission system operators, Ukrenergo, for electricity, and the gas transmission system operator of Ukraine for gas, are natural monopolies. Energoatom has a very large share, a dominant share in the market, and at the same time there are security concerns about nuclear energy. And finally, Ukrhydroenergo has a much smaller share in the market, but nevertheless, if you look at how this market works, if you look at how the balancing works in that market, it's a company that fulfills a very important function as well. If you have to pick one that would be best fit for privatization in some future, I think Ukrhydroenergo would be that company. But then again, we get back to the working of the market, how the market works. If the market is able to fulfill that need, then this company could be privatized. If the energy regulation is stronger and especially enjoys the trust of the market participants, then I think any of these companies, including the transmission system operators, could be at least partly privately owned or fully privately owned, as the case is in other countries. So the state, in fact, has a very important role in terms of creating a market, with a strong competition, and when it cannot, ensuring proper regulation. So when Ukraine does that, I think each of the 5 companies could be privately owned. And when the state is not very good at ensuring competition and is not very good at ensuring regulation, it just chooses to do the things that the market would otherwise do itself. And this is what Ukraine does today. And I worked with Ivan Miklos, the former deputy prime minister of Slovakia in the Dzurinda government, and he said on several occasions to me, and I think it's true, in a country such as Ukraine, a private monopoly is worse than a state-owned monopoly. So when it comes to the transmission system operators, I think Ukraine has today to run these companies itself. And when we arrive at that conclusion, we get into the topic of good corporate governance. So since the choice has been made by the state to own these companies, then we talk about good corporate governance at the level of those companies. But again, I think state ownership is the second best solution, and the state is has a very important role in terms of creating the market and ensuring strong regulation.
Okay. I want to follow up before I go to Ed and then Valentin. If there is legitimate reason for the state to keep owning these 5 or 4 out of the 5, then why are they failing to meet Ukraine's energy needs? And I'm talking Naftogaz, declining oil and gas production. I'm talking Ukrenergo, the grid operator, archaic and irregular, as I understand it, setting energy prices below market. And the gas transit system operator made headlines in the last month for not collecting more than $300 million from one of its main client, who runs monopoly regional gas distributions owned by Dmitry Firtash, and they say they have no legal powers to collect. All of that seems like an argument for failed state ownership.
Yeah, these are the typical fallacies, the typical disadvantages of state ownership. So when a company is owned by the state, it risks. There are a number of typical risks. One obvious risk in a country like Ukraine is corruption, of course, but it's not the only one. So there is risk of political meddling. If it's easier for a private party to influence the government so that the government influences the state-owned company, and the state-owned company is not collecting debts for that matter, then the private party will choose to do that. And it's so much more difficult to arrive at the same agreement with a privately owned company. There are also other consequences and other risks related to that. For example, a state-owned company yields much easier to the pressure on social issues. So laying off redundant workers, for example, is much more difficult for a state-owned company than it is for a private company. If the state has not ensured a properly working market, and the state has not ensured proper regulation and appropriate compensation for public service obligations, for example, it's so much easier for the state to decree that a company should sell electricity or gas or anything else at an administratively set price, which is low enough to keep the voters happy, but at the same time inefficient, because the company would be selling gas or electricity at a low price to everyone, right? So, and those are the typical risks that explain many of the inefficiencies of state-owned companies.
Okay. I think now is a good time to talk to Edward, because he's not going to be a Ukrainian energy expert forever. We hope for still a long time. But Edward, what do we need to know about what you've learned to be the problems in the energy sector and how we might be able to solve them in a way that's climate friendly and gets the nation to energy independence in an affordable way, sustainable way?
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you for the invitation of joining this webinar with Valentin and with Andre. I'm particularly an admirer of Andre's work. I have the benefit of reading it every week in the Kiev Post, his report on state-owned enterprises, because I think he brings out the right facts as well as asks the right questions that should be examined in the public space. Having said that, let me disagree with Andre on whether Ukraine is really operating on the second best solution or not. And the way Andre described it, it is as if this was a deliberate, rational policy choice on the part of the Ukrainian government. And I don't see it that way. It's a legacy of the Soviet Union, of a command economy, and Ukrainian politicians have found it convenient, for their own reasons, to hold on to control of the energy sector. And he mentioned actually a number of the reasons why it is so convenient to Ukrainian politicians. And, you know, monopolies are bad. Monopolies are bad whether it's held by state-owned companies or privately owned companies. I would not want ExxonMobil to be producing 70% of United States natural gas. It's a privately owned company, but I wouldn't want it to do that because, you know, I'm biased coming from the States, thinking that market competition drives efficiency and provides the best energy services for the consumers at the same time. You certainly need independent regulation. That's a very important element of it, which I agree is missing in Ukraine. But I really just wonder whether this current system is at all sustainable. I came to Ukraine 20 years ago, and everyone told me back then that Ukraine should be gas self-sufficient. 20 years later, Ukraine is still not gas self-sufficient. Ukrainian gas production is around 20 billion cubic meters a year. Whether the price is $50 or $400, it's always 20 billion cubic meters a year or thereabouts, which suggests that there's a market failure. Because the market doesn't respond to the price signal at all. It is the government's role to look for after the public good, and there may be natural monopolies, and now whether those natural monopolies need to be 100% owned by the state is a separable question, but there may be but it's hard for me to think that Ukraine is more energy secure because a state-owned enterprise produces almost all its oil and produces 70% of its gas. There's a reason why private gas producers' production is increasing. And, you know, UGV's gas production is declining, and it would be interesting and useful to explore the reasons why.
The gas production arm of Naftogaz.
Yes. And the question is, should you continue on the current path, or should you be doing something differently? You know, we don't live in a perfect world. The question is, what's the direction of policy? The market needs to understand it is the government's job in an industry like energy that requires long-term stable conditions under which long-term investments can take place to understand the environment. And having the government act like it ought to be able to control energy prices is not particularly helpful in that regard. You have a energy sector that's starved of investment to begin with, and the government, through different mechanisms, public service obligations, price ceilings, and so forth, want to act like it can regulate prices, leading to less than ideal results, I would say. I was interested last night to read an article about Energo in the Kiev Post. And a very good Ukrainian analyst says that, yes, it's true that Energo has been poorly managed for a long time. Actually, Energo, as long as I've been in Ukraine, have been kind of the political plaything of the party in power for a very long time. And the expert, who I respect very much, says that, well, it's probably, the government shouldn't privatize it too soon because it's poorly managed, you won't get full value for it, we should wait until it can be properly managed. Well, when the heck is it ever going to be properly managed? If Energo had been privatized 10 years ago, wouldn't Ukraine be better off than it is today, where Energo is a liability, it's a drain on the public coffer rather than a contributor to the public coffer? I have a new insight that I've acquired after working around the world for 40-some years in the energy sector, that it is the job of private companies to make profits. That everyone understands. That's what they're there for, to make profits for their owner or shareholders. And capital markets discipline them when they're not doing a good job by their share price or by their cost borrowing, etc. I'm beginning to believe it is the job of publicly owned companies to spend money, not to make money. If you spend money in the right way, in a way that advantages certain political interests, then you're doing a good job. And the question is, is that sustainable or not? Is that the best system that Ukraine, which claims that it wants to build a market economy, not the socialist economy that it inherited, is that a sustainable path, or should they be Ukraine should be trying something different?
That is a very good overall summation. Energo, remind me, they're a big electricity producer, but how much of do you know offhand how big they are?
What percentage
of the electricity they generate?
I do not.
It's one of the big ones. Now it's time to go to Valentin, I think, because Valentin, you've heard the discussion. And I want to pick up what Andre said. If there's one of the big 5 state-owned energy companies that should be privatized, it would be yours, where you're the head of the supervisory board. Do you agree with that? And further to the point, what is, historically, okay, almost all big fortunes in Ukraine have been made to the energy sector, much of it corruptly. Is your Ukrhydroenergo different? And to start with, for all the public, including me, explain what is Ukrhydroenergo, what it does. Oh. We can't hear. Hold on. We can't hear Valentin. Now we can.
Hear me?
Now we're here.
Perfectly. Thank you very much, Brian. Dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to participate in this very important and interesting discussion, actually. And as Andrei said, regarding the possible privatization of Ukrhydroenergo, I would say the following. You know, privatization is, to my mind, is a good way to get rid of something which is not very profitable, but which can be very profitable in a good hands. I think it's not an issue here with Ukrhydroenergo because it's already extremely profitable, and today we're talking if it's in a good hands, yeah. And what I would like to say, sometimes I feel myself a little bit uncomfortable because on discussions like this, mostly people talk about problems and about possible ways how to save state-owned companies, which terribly which has terribly bad conditions. It's not our case. I mean, it's not the case of Ukrhydroenergo, because thanks to corporate governance, actually, which was implemented 2 years ago together with other companies, our company, by the way, it's an interesting fact. This year, Oecd made their, let's say, screening if they monitored corporate governance reform in top 15 state-owned companies. And based on this monitoring, Ukrhydroenergo is the only company which fulfilled 100% of all demands. So we met all requests and we've met all demands of this organization, of their standards in corporate governance. And we can see today that it was super beneficial for the company to have supervisory board and have this corporate reform, because we made so much efforts to make company even better. For last 2 years, our company growth in its price, actually, and we every year after year we have more and more incomes, and it's open information that only for last year we paid dividends about 1.5 billion Ukrainian hryvnias. And this current years, our company already have a financial result. We already achieved it. Almost 8 billion Ukrainian hryvnias before taxation. So we have a very good prognosis for the end of the year. I believe it will be about 15 billion Ukrainian hryvnia, which is very, very serious result. And by the way, imposing of corporate governance here helped us to attract new financial from international finance organizations. Everyone knows, I hope you've heard it as well, that we attracted a loan from World Bank and from Fund of Clear Technologies for $211 million to implement absolutely innovative project in the energy sector. We are going to build storage facilities for 1,000 megawatt, which is huge. I know that DTEC already built something like this for 1 megawatt, but it will be much bigger capacity. And we, for us, it's very important because, as Andrei mentioned, Ukrhydroenergo have very unique position on energy market. We performing the function of balancing of energy system. In very simple words, we give to energy system actually electricity when it's really needed at the moment. So, for example, if we talk about balancing power from other generations, such as cogeneration generation or other type of balancing power, we can put energy into the system during up to 1 minute. So to avoid blackout, we can put a button and water flows, and we can produce energy immediately, almost immediately. But up to 1 minute is still too much. It's still too long time. That's why we need more powerful instruments such as storage batteries, which will mean if we will finish them, we will be able to balance energy system in 1 second. Of course, it gives us some competitive advantage because nobody have possibility to perform like this. That's why we have good chance to grow. And thanks to corporate governance, this company received so much new, so much new features. We put best practices to our corporate governance, and the company already benefited from this. Now we have a few programs such as gender issues program. We also created risk management system. We put in place compliance procedures. We're doing a lot of other stuff which was unfamiliar and absolutely new for the company. But now, thanks to these activities and to corporate governance, our company is able to attract even more finances from other institutions, and this is pivotal issues for the company. And Brian, you mentioned that Ukrhydroenergo in the past, some time ago, faced some political pressure from representative of government. Yes, personally myself, I was a subject of such kind of pressure about 1 year ago by the previous government. It was government of Goncharuk, and they put a lot of pressure on us, on independent members, and they were asking us to do illegal things. And of course, we reported such illegal activity immediately. It was 2 weeks before this government left the office, actually. And after that, when it was current government, I can openly declare that we have no pressure on us. Nobody dictate us what to do. Nobody demands from us anything. Just our performance. And just to mention, our supervisory board overperformed twice and even sometimes 3 times our KPI, which we actually indicators which they put for us, and they have no grounds for any critics of supervisory board. Now, company is very profitable. Everything's fine, no scandals.
Oh my God, we got good news.
We believe that we are really good example. Yeah.
So this
really
is the opportune time to do an IPO.
Exactly.
Valentin, I want to ask you, I want to get to the basics so everybody in the public understands exactly how much electricity, it's all through hydro energy, which is supposedly clean, has its own environmental issues, but how much electricity does Ukrhydroenergo produce in a year, and what percentage of the electricity needs does that cover?
If we take for 1% of all energy system, our performance is not so huge on the market. Our part of market is not so huge. It's up to 10%. But if we mention in the numbers, it will be for 2020 we produced 6,900,000,000 kilowatt per hour. It's very big quantity of electricity. But our income is not only from produced electricity, we also provide a lot of additional services on electricity market. This is the specific of our company. For example, this balancing power, which helps to perform, to maintain continuous performance of energy system is very important, and it's a little bit more expensive than regular electricity. That's why it's our competitive advantage. That's why we earn a little bit more.
Brian.
Okay. Go ahead, Ed.
Valentin, this is an excellent track record that the company that you chair, the supervisory board, has, and I'm very happy to hear it. It's not so unusual for hydroelectricity to be publicly owned around the world. I mean, for many reasons. I mean, among which is there are other public goods that's delivered by dams than just hydroelectricity, water supply, irrigation for agriculture, and most of the value is in the land, usually public land, that was given for the dam to be built to begin with. So this is not so unusual. But, you know, if I listen to Valentin's explanation, if you have a properly run state-owned enterprise, what is the reason not to do an initial public offering so that the investing public can also participate in investing in, particularly the Ukrainian investing public, in this well-run company? The state would then be able to capture some of the value in the company earlier for general revenue purposes. It would also take away the future temptation of not the current government, no comment on the current government, for some future government to interfere in the operation of a company that's 100% state-owned. You know, I don't know what the magic formula is, but why not make it available for public investment by floating it on the capital markets that is going to continue to discipline the performance of this already well-run company?
Valentin.
Yes, Edward. It's a good point, actually, but it's always a subject of very hot discussions, not only in Ukraine, but, for example, in Germany. You know that Deutsche Bahn, for example, is 100% state-owned company, and it's also profitable, actually. And their politicians also had a lot of discussions. Let's attract even more finances, even more possibilities to develop better services for our customers, etc., etc. And they said in final discussions, they said no, because the main reason is a state security issues. For example, our company, yes, our energy is completely green, but it's also have, let's to be fair, it's also have a threat. For example, if some technical catastrophe can appear, even city of Kiev can be washed out. And these issues are very sensitive. I think that is the reason which maybe stops our owner, Ukrainian people, to sell it even using IPO, a partial instrument of gaining, attracting more capital. I don't know. I think this is the answer to your question is not in our power. I think that our government have to have a vision, strategic vision. Are they ready in general to such behavior with their property? Because I don't know any good example of Ukrainian state-owned company which could even think about such kind of things. Yes, we're ready. If today someone will decide we need to go to initial public offering, we're ready like nobody else. Because we've been on the audit, we have a huge package of IFO, international financial organizations, and we monitoring by everyone. We have good corporate governance in place, and but I don't know if our country will benefit from it. It's interesting to hear your point of view, by the way, as a specialist, as an expert.
Brian, if you permit me, and a few more seconds and I'll shut up.
No, please do.
I mean, I think this kind of public forum is really important to bring out relevant facts, to debate and argue about why doing things one way or the other would be ideal, or even second best solution to it. As opposed to saying, you know, populist slogans like, you know, if we do that, then the people will lose control. The country is always sovereign. The government can control whatever it wants through laws and regulation if it wanted to. Or that you know, someone was going to jack up the prices, we want to keep prices low, and so on and so forth. So I think this kind of, you know, and I applaud the Kiev Post for having webinars like this that bring this to a public discussion. What I don't see is a theory of the case from the Ukrainian government of why they hold on to assets. I'm very happy to hear Andrei and Valentin explain the possibilities of why it would be good to do one thing or the other. Let me give you a very simple example on something that I know more about, which is oil and gas. Under a lot of European pressure, the gas pipeline system was unbundled from Naftogaz, right? Because the economic theory behind this is that it's a natural monopoly. If it's controlled by an oil and gas producer, then that oil and gas producer may manipulate the market at the disadvantage of competition. So if it's natural monopoly, it should be unbundled from Naftogaz, which is a oil and gas producer. Very good. The Europeans were interested because they're particularly sensitive to gas security issues related to Ukraine. Why doesn't the same economic theory apply to Ukrhydroenergo? If it applies to gas, why doesn't it apply to oil? Why doesn't anyone pay attention to, if that's the reason why we unbundled one, why doesn't it apply to the other? To me, it suggests that there is no theory of the case from the government, that it just does what it's able to do, what it is forced to do, but it doesn't necessarily look at what is the right form of ownership, what is the most economically efficient and sustainable energy system that we want to maintain.
Andre?
It's a good point. And I think we do not necessarily disagree with you. We just draw attention to different points, and I'll get back to this later. But let me speak about the unbundling of the gas transmission system operator. And I think the explanation is relatively simple. The economic theory in the case of Ukrenergo and the gas TSO is the same. The regulation is different. You have the third energy package of the European Union, which says that the unbundling does have to take place for gas and electricity, but it is silent on oil. And I think the explanation is as simple as that.
So Ukrainians are reforming for Europeans, not for
in
Ukraine?
This case, I think in this case, it's an outcome of a gas market law, which was an implementation of the.
No, I understand the practical reasons why it happened the way it did.
So you have the normative pressure, and
right.
But one thing, it almost looked as if we were debating if Ukrhydroenergo is to be privatized, and I don't think this is the central topic of our discussion. But I think the value of this debate indeed is that we can raise, we can talk about the criteria, and where I agree with Edward is that profitability is very often seen by politicians as the case for not privatizing. In my eyes, as an economist, it's actually an argument for privatization. And if you want to start privatization, I'd rather start with the profitable ones than with the junk that nobody's willing to buy, in order to show that it. And in that respect, The reason that Ukrhydroenergo, in my opinion, cannot be privatized today is precisely the security concerns and the arguments that Valentin raised. And if those didn't exist, I think it would be a good case. The corporate governance, Valentin knows I'm a big believer in corporate governance. I hold a PhD in corporate governance from a Western university, and I came to Ukraine to design the corporate governance reform for Naftogaz, and then on a national level. And actually, the supervisory board of Ukrenergo is one of the things that is an outcome of that reform. But this does not mean that the state is a more efficient owner in principle. Though I think we are on the same page, and we have to make these arguments clear. I think Valentin is doing a very good job at Ukrhydroenergo as board's chair, and I'm sure you would be doing an equally good job in a privately owned company. So in that sense, I think we, in some cases, we do not contradict each other, but it looks as if we did. And the corporate governance, good corporate governance, is indeed a very good tool for running state-owned companies efficiently, if those companies are to be owned by the state.
Valentin, I want to go back to, I mean, if everything you're saying is true, and I believe you,
I can assure you.
Can you hear me?
I can assure you.
Okay, and then Ukrhydroenergo is a complete anomaly in state-owned enterprises. I think you would agree with that too, because as everybody knows here in this panel, the reason why they're so attractive to politicians and corruption is because once you have a state-owned company, you have intermediaries attached to it that sell things to the state-owned enterprise at inflated prices and buy things at low prices, and this is how fortunes are made.
And not unique to Ukraine, by the way. This is a global
Right.
phenomenon.
Why do you guys stand, why? Why are you guys the odd person out? I mean, we're glad, but why, what happened to the other state-owned enterprises?
Let me give a few facts and a few thoughts. That's a great question, actually, which is very interesting, because if we answer in this question, we give a recipe to other companies how to act in a good way and how to achieve a good results. Yes, every and each company has its own history and its own circumstances. Different management before it was corporatized. For example, Ukrzalyznytsia, you understand that they inherited a lot of problems, and even good governance, as you see, could not help the situation. And it's a question of separate discussion in every company. But in general, we have a few recommendations. I can share with you my thoughts. For example, let's go to the OECD recommendation of good governance. They say, okay, state-owned company have to be corporatized. This is number one. It have to be. It's not an issue anymore. It's not in question anymore. So those who are not have to finish the reform. They have to be corporatized. They need to receive a normal international face. They need to receive independent supervisory board. Let's start that supervisory board have to be mostly, have to have a majority of independent members. And this is very big problem. If you go now and analyze the personal content, let's say, of current state-owned companies' boards, unfortunately, not of them fully equipped with these well-balanced members. Not everywhere independent members have majority right now. And if we talk about Ukrhydroenergo, we always had this balance. We had 4 independent members from the very beginning, and to be true, we're really independent, and we always had our own opinion, which not always was pleasant for even not only for company, but also for our boss, for our shareholder. But we were trying to find the solution because we understood that it's our aim to act between shareholder and company, representing shareholder, but taking care about best interest of the company in the end. Because in the end, we will be responsible for financial result before shareholder. And if we will follow illegal or not, let's say, not wise, let's use this word, maybe it's not very good word, advice of shareholder, in the end, we will be guilty in bad results. And another, so the answer is independent and absolutely professional supervisory board. Another issue, which is a big problem for other companies, is CEO. It's a general manager of the company who have to be not only professional, but also this institution, let's say, not a person, let's say institution, because it's an institution, it's a body of the company. It have to be sustainable. It have to be, it have to know what's happening. And if we see the situation when chairman of the company changes every 6 months, you cannot expect a good result from such company. For example, in our company, general manager of the company serving for 11 years. And what we just see, we see long-term projects, such as 6 years term projects, 7 years projects, which already finished. And another project for long-term period, ongoing process. If a person performs perfectly, you have to use those benefits and support this person, what we just doing. And we see that company is growing in numbers. For example, current price of the company, the price of its assets actually, it's about 40 billion Ukrainian hryvnia. It's growing every year for 10 or 15%, depends on the year. It shows a good performance of management, first of all. So supervisory board have to be very careful about CEO of the company, actually. This is another key to success. So if everyone do his job properly, independently and professionally, company has chance for success. This is very simply. It's not only about state-owned companies. It's about, in general, even privately owned company has the same rules. Of course, for me, it's very difficult to talk about problems in other state-owned companies because I don't know details. For me, it's not easy to know.
It's easier for me to talk about that. I'll play the role of the journalist. But okay, we come back. We've said many things about the necessity of an independent supervisory board. But guys, isn't it politicians who appoint this independent supervisory board? In which case, what is the criteria and how do you ensure that they're picking somebody who's independent and qualified and competent rather than just a crony? Because, I mean, the compensation, as it should be, is relatively decent for these positions and for the CEO positions. That's one thing, and I know Andrei's got very well deep knowledge on this. The other thing is, I go back to what Anders Asland, who was on the supervisory board of Ukrhydroenergo, and this is where I'll take my journalistic liberties and say everything I know that's wrong with Ukrhydroenergo. Yes, the trains come and go, usually on schedule, but it's not an energy company, but it has a lot of energy implications. One is, as I understand it, they don't charge market tariffs. And so the rails get basically subsidizing the heavy carriers of steel, metal, coal, or even grain. and so the rails get run into the ground with no investment. Secondly, it's bloated, feather bedding, twice as many employees as they need, 3 times as many employees as they need, whatever the case is. And thirdly, they have CEOs coming and going every 6 months, which is what you talked about. And you know what Anders Aslan told me, who's no longer on the board, said even to change the tariff, we had to go through 11, like several state agencies, and they all had to sign off. And in the end, nothing got changed, and I think he left out of frustration. So how do you ensure, I'll boil it down to 2 things. How do you ensure that you really have an independent supervisory board? And secondly, how do you ensure that they have the powers to change things?
I think that's again the job of the state to create, to establish a transparent, a merit-based and competitive nomination process, which many countries have succeeded at for state-owned enterprises. Now, but it always remains in a country like Ukraine. So look at you mentioned Ukrzaliznytsia. Yeah, so we saw the report of the Parliamentary Commission on Ukrzaliznytsia that made a number of recommendations. One is to dismiss the CEO, right? I think they made that recommendation before the CEO was replaced most recently, but nevertheless. A second recommendation was to to have the supervisory board composed of industry experts, deputy ministers, and parliament members, which is not even allowed by law. So I mean, you always have the biggest question you have in this case, what does parliament have to do with Ukrzaliznytsia in the first place, right? But because it is state-owned, there's always the temptation to do something about it. So I mean, I didn't count how many times the CEO at Ukrenergo has changed. Ukrhydroenergo has been luckier in that respect, but even Valentin mentioned that one government ago they were facing the pressure that was not that great. So in that respect, the risk always remains, and I think it's the job of the state to, like I said, the job of the state is to create a market and to ensure independent regulation. And when it cannot, it has to do the job itself of running an SOE. But
is it the best manager of economic
No,
assets?
it's not the best manager. We see that in the numbers. So we can cite all kind of research saying that privately owned companies perform better than state-owned companies internationally. So this is
So why doesn't the state? I'm sorry. Why doesn't the state perform its core function, which is, as you said, to provide market competition and independent regulation, so that the investment conditions are there for private enterprises to enter the market and compete? I
think there are 3 reasons for that. One is that the planning horizon of a typical politician is shorter than the planning horizon of a large SOE or large company in the first place, right? So to get a company such as Ukrzaliznytsia reformed, you need more time than the 4 or 5 years that you were elected for. Second reason is the temptation, the usual temptations, getting access to public wealth and being able to use it. And I think a third reason is that creating a market is a more difficult job than changing a CEO in a state-owned company. So,
but it's now 30 years later, Andre.
I know, but the legacy, you mentioned the legacy, I didn't.
Yeah, and so how much longer does Ukrainian society have to wait? In a democracy, I think all of us are engaged in this public discussion in order to inform society in a democracy, to recognize the real issues And then at some point, hopefully, elected representative will respond to that public understanding and pressure, rather than doing what's most convenient for them. Which, as you say, again, no comment on this government or some future government, it's just too tempting for politicians. Maybe, if everything's good at Valentin's company today, maybe 5 years from now, there's a different government and it's still 100% state-owned. So maybe there's an opportunity to do some things that the current authorities are not interested in doing. So, having the building blocks of a market economy, which Ukraine wants to build, is really, really crucial. And the energy sector is so key to development of the rest of the country that you don't get the energy sector right, it impacts everyone else.
Right.
Also, now Ukraine is this fascinating country. I love this country. I love its people. It's got all this diversity that's really interesting for a visitor to come regularly. But you just wish it would fulfill its potential. Its economic potential. I'm talking about more than it is. And a stronger Ukraine is by far the best national security defense than a weak Ukraine. Weak Ukraine would be too tempting to any aggressive state. So I think we're all kind of talking about the same elements of the problem, and Ukrainians must decide. This should not be decided by foreigners, right? Ukrainians has to decide. Ukraine should not be doing something because it's part of the EU association agreement. Yes, it is part of a EU association agreement, and if that's a good thing to do for Ukraine, then those same principles should apply to other areas, other sectors as well, for the good of Ukraine, not to please some European or some American or whoever, but for Ukrainian people's benefit. These issues need to be aired, discussed, debated, and Ukrainians can then formulate whatever the best path Ukrainians choose.
I think that Ukrainians would like it, but to seize the future. But I think people feel powerless against them, and I name names. The three oligarchs who are very big players in energy, and that's Rinat Akhmetov in electricity. It is Igor Kolomoisky in oil. It is Dmytro Firtash in gas. And we're talking, if not monopolies, we're talking major players. Not with a beneficial impact, I think most Ukrainians would say. Can there be progress without
So what
doing
you're talking
something
about, and it's very legitimate, very understandable, is distrust on the part of society that if privatization were to take place, it would not be done fairly. It would be for the advantage of certain, well-placed individuals, politically connected individuals, and so on. And that is a real danger, given the legacy, the history of Ukraine. But that doesn't take away the economic logic of where you want to get to. So you need to design a process that has the public's confidence. And you can't do that overnight. I get that. But you have to maybe start with certain parts of the energy sector, create some success stories in order to build confidence, not only in the Ukrainian public, but in the investor community as well. But there needs to be a pathway. And right now, I don't see a pathway. I see Ukraine zigzagging rather than choosing a direction, moving forward with it, explaining to the average citizen why it's doing what it's doing, making the political case for it. And I think in a democracy, that's really super important. You know, and that's true in my country as well as other countries as well. You can't do anything right without that public confidence. But that doesn't take away the need to do it, though.
Okay, you're right. I mean, but even without the large-scale privatization, ordinary people see, and I know you're on the DTEC's advisory council, that DTEC produces what percentage of the largest producer of electricity in the country, okay? They see that...
No. I mean, Energoatom is the largest producer of electricity in this country.
Nuclear power, you got me there.
I mean, for the sake of correctness, Energoatom has the largest share. I think it's around 55%.
Slightly over 50%.
DTEC is responsible for most electricity produced from coal-fired electricity.
And what percentage is that? 30%?
I don't have the numbers for coal-fired electricity, but it's definitely DTEC that has the largest share in there.
Got that. I mean, so we see one oligarch with big stake in that sector. We see one oil refinery in the hands of Igor Kolomoisky, and we see that even without privatization, well, Dmytro Firtash managed to become like the gas supplier to 70% of the population.
But you have an anti-monopoly commission.
Right.
You have a energy regulatory commission that are supposedly independent, but really are not, right? At least that's the history of it. But it could be. And if these are monopoly players manipulating the market for monopoly rent, then they sue the hell out of them. You know, I mean, do it in a legal process. And don't say, well, you know, we can't do anything to reform yet because otherwise these big boys are going to win. Well, cut the big boys down to size if that's what you need to do, but do it on the basis of principles, laws, and regulation. Don't do it in a way that suggests selective justice. That when a particular oligarch gets out of line, then we're going to go after them, but not someone else who, you know, television stations allow us to appear and don't attack us. I mean, that's the way, and again, you know, I'm not trying to comment on current politics, but that's the way it's been in the 20 years that I've observed the Ukrainian economic.
Speaking of the 20 or 30 years and the public confidence, I wrote a chapter on SOE reform and privatization 2 or 3 years ago, and to do that I looked up the numbers. Public support for privatization since 1991, and
very interesting.
The people saying they were supporting privatization in 1991, the number of those people was much larger than the number of people opposing privatization. But then those two lines along the, as time passed, those two lines met, and then you have what you have today is that you have more people opposing privatization than people supporting privatization. You have the only upsurge in 2014 when we had the revolution of dignity, so people had more trust in the reforms in general and in the market reforms. But then it got back to the situation that I described. So we digged into that. We asked the Center for Economic Strategy to do a survey. And what you see in the response is that people support statements that private owners are better than the state. People support statements that privately owned companies are more efficient than state-owned companies. But at the same time, they do not trust that the privatization process will be fair and transparent. And for that reason, they oppose privatization, which does not give the tools that politicians would, well, I mean, some of the tools that the politicians would need is the public confidence, of course. And it's very difficult. I understand it's very difficult to promote a reform that doesn't have the public trust. But at the same time, I think it's the job of the politicians to create that trust.
It's a kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? You don't have the political will.
May I add this issue? Sorry for...
Jump in, Valentin. Sure.
I just want to mention that at the beginning of our conversation, Edward just said absolutely important thing, that Ukraine is a post-Soviet country. And can you imagine, we say, okay, 30 years of independence, it's a long time, but in reality, it's not a long time for such kind of transformation after such kind of disaster. Yes, it could be faster, but we still have in mind of people, let's say, something from those period of time. And let me assure you that this reform of corporate governance, which been made a few years ago in Ukraine, started in Ukraine. Let's say started. It was a huge step forward. In general, it's not possible to make it happen like this in 1 or 2 years, because state-owned companies need long period of time for big investment projects. What we really need now to make it better and to believe in our better future is to receive quicker new law, which you maybe have heard was a subject of review by our parliament. The aim of this law is to make stronger corporate governance in state-owned companies. The idea of this law is to give more power to supervisory board, more responsibility to supervisory board, and in this way to make involvement of state officials from the state lesser and lesser, and to make closer our state-owned companies to international standards. This is what we need to focus on, because it's our future steps. This is what we need to support, and this is what we need to request from our government right now to move forward and forward. And all other things depends on people, you know.
Valentin, I mean, I support you in, well, I mean, you refer to the OECD review of corporate governance. My team were official consultants to the OECD on that review. So, of course, we stand by the ideas that you're saying. You're citing the law. We actually drafted a previous version of that law. So we support the ideas that that you're discussing right now. I mean, not only support, but initiate them. But speaking of the legacy issue, it's true that there's a legacy, but you have other examples. You have Poland, that was also a post-Soviet country. Okay, not as much legacy as in Ukraine, but nevertheless, it went very fast. I was lucky to work with Leszek Balcerowicz for a while, and some people say, yeah, he was lucky because, well, they did everything very quickly, nobody noticed. And that argument would be valid if you didn't have the example of Slovakia, which did the same thing 10 years later after a corrupt government by Mečiar. So it's possible. And I support all the corporate governance statements that you made, of course. And I'm probably one of the most fierce advocates of the draft law that you mentioned. But I would like more from the state than that, let's say.
Well, we have an age-old in Ukraine's history of a couple issues. One is I'm surprised any Ukrainian would support privatization, considering the way it was conducted initially, non-transparently, rigged, et cetera, et cetera. Secondly, we're at the stage, and we talk about oligarchs, but is the state more powerful than the oligarchs? I think most people would say no, not now. We don't have a strong enough state. And that tips the balance to the oligarchs. But we have, we're down to the last 15 minutes, and I want to get a final sense of where we could be going. There's a sense hanging in there that this can't go on forever, but in the energy sector I'm talking about. Is that really the case? Or, I mean, Or can we just get by another 10, 15, 20 years with aging nuclear power plants with enough gas, but importing a third of our gas needs? We'll get by. Somehow the lights go on, the lights go off when we flip the switch. Or is there going to be a reckoning soon? And how does, what I want to ask you three is how we position ourselves for this reckoning. And by this reckoning, I mean we're going to switch from the Russian electricity grid to the European one soon. Is that going to be good? We have the future is renewable energy. Everybody knows this. And yet we have huge problems there. Will Ukraine benefit if again, by external pressure, things like the carbon adjustment tax, where if we produce dirty electricity or dirty energy, gas, oil, that we will be penalized for that. So that is, I mean, I think that is a good way to give the final thoughts about what needs to happen. Are we, you know, we hear from DTEC, Maxim Timchenko, the CEO, speaks very eloquently on the problems of not having a real market in electricity. And I mean, is it a crisis? If it is, how do we get out of it? What are the long-term dangers of just going along with the way we are now? I don't know who wants to start, but whoever is ready to give their final thoughts, jump in.
Maybe I can start, Brian. Maybe I can start. Actually, for us, these future changes, switch from Russia to EU, I mean, cooperation between energy systems, and the energy system was integrated, as you know, in Soviet Union, so we just became a part of it. So for Ukraine, it's not so easy to redesign all this structure, but it is not impossible. It is possible. And as we know, in 2015 or 14, EU association agreement was signed between Ukraine and the EU. And based on this agreement, Ukraine obliged, starting from this autumn, and if I'm not wrong, even in October or in the end of September, it will be first start actions. First start actions will be done to connect Ukrainian system with European energy system. So it will be testing connection. We will see how it will work, but we don't know. The question, will we benefit from it or will we lose by connecting to such powerful, modern, let's say, system with all our old and not very clean electricity system? We don't know if we lose or win, but we hope we will win, and we need to do as much efforts as we can to win, because let me remind you, we have atomic stations, we have hydro energy stations, and they are quite clean in some perspective. Germany said that atomic stations, it's not their issue, and they closed all of them. But we have 5. I don't know how it will work. I think that we have no choice. We simply have no choice but to start develop our strong energy sector and to start to compete with European companies who generate energy like this. And to be true, we have a lot of actually chances and advantages. We have very soft taxation pressure if to compare this taxation pressure, for example, with Germany or other countries where taxes are very high, and in Ukraine we have actually low taxes because 18% of income tax in general, it's not high percentage of tax in comparison with European Union countries, major of them. So we will see. As for Hydroenergo, I think that we will just win because by this situation we've been pushed to modernize our producing bases. The idea of building new storage facilities also came from future perspective. because we understood that if we want to comply with all demands of European energy system, we need to be prepared for that. And this battery is absolutely necessary to avoid blackout in 1 second, not in 1 minute like we have it now. So all our people, all our customers will benefit, not only state and state-owned companies. That's my position. We need to fight.
Okay, thanks, Valentin.
You know, this alarm bell
Edward.
have been ringing for a very long time for Ukraine on energy and energy security. You know, if for one thing, we saw the gas corruption that was part and parcel with the relationship with Russia. That ended in 2014 because of Russian aggression, and there was no longer any reason for the gas corruption to go forward. Interesting to me that I find a consensus in Ukraine, certainly after 2014, that Ukrainians want to be in a normal European country and aspires to be part of Europe, and so on. There is less difference on that issue today than it was, say, 10, 15 years ago. The question is, what's the pathway for getting there? You know, and is there a coherent, not strategy in the sense of this is where we want to be 5, 10 years from now, but how are we going to get there?
Yeah.
Rather than this zigzag that I see where the government goes back and forth of whether, you know, it wants to have public service obligations or no public service obligations, whether there should be price ceilings or no price ceilings. And is it easy to do? No. But the consequences of not doing it is at the jeopardy of Ukraine's European aspirations. Europe is your largest trading partner as a bloc. Europe is going to go through a green transition. This is an alarm bell. If you don't integrate with Europe and being part of a larger European market, in theory, should make you more energy secure, not less energy secure, and you can continue to trade with Europe. But for that, it needs modernization of the energy sector. And the energy sector is starved of cash. And so it really, you know, having the lowest electricity prices in Europe, with the exception maybe of Belarus, is not the best position to be in if you know you need funds to modernize your energy infrastructure. So get on with it. You know, I mean, is it easy? Absolutely not. Land reform was a heavy lift, right? I mean, it's been controversial for very many years. But at some point, the argument is made that there are benefits to this reform and we need to go forward. It's time. It's time to do this. And I really think that integration with the European energy system writ large, as well as Europe's green transition, is another alarm bell for Ukraine to get its energy act together.
Okay, thanks, Edward. Andrei, you have the last word.
Well, would like to get back to the original question that you asked at the beginning, and that was whether or not state-owned energy companies were run efficiently. And I think the answer that we arrived today at is the state can be a better owner in some cases than it is in other cases, as Valentin explained today. So there is no doubt about that. I think I'm not sure about Valentin, but I think we agree that whenever anything can be privately owned, it's better than when it is state-owned, so that the state can focus on its other very, very important functions of creating and maintaining an efficient market, ensuring proper regulation, and actually removing this temptation for the politicians, because the politicians that end up being politicians are actually people interested in getting access to public wealth rather than people interested in promoting public policies. At the same time, I think one of the conclusions today can be that to get there, we must start at better corporate governance in state-owned companies. That's feasible. That's feasible. Privatizing one of the 5 companies we're discussing today is not feasible. But it must be the ultimate objective. And I think we have to establish this at the level of a consensus in this society. And we must understand that it's a long-term objective, but it is the objective. And then I think it is possible to avoid the zigzags that you were I agree with the zigzags, because when we're talking about privatization today, we're not discussing the government's plan to establish a national state-owned airline. So I mean, you do have the zigzags because you don't have the established long-term vision. And I think what could be one of the valuable conclusions from our discussions today, that we need to agree, we need to have the society agree on that objective in the long run.
All right, we are, I want to finally thank DTEK, the largest private energy company in Ukraine, Go Law, certainly one of the best law firms in Ukraine, and Albert Einstein was right. These guys could explain it simply because they understand what they're talking about. And I'm talking about 3 smart guys here, Valentin Golosti, Edward Chow, and Andrei Boytsun, and the journalist who tagged along for the conversation, Brian Bonner, chief editor of the Key Post. Thank you all for joining. We'll see you at the next webinar.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Valentin.
Good to meet you, Valentin, virtually. Hope we'll meet in person one day.
Hope so. Thank you. Likewise. Thanks. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right.